Okay, well, seeing as it is 7:30, shall we get started and yeah, crack on into it?
Cool. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining. So this is kind of part of the WAC education series that we're doing, and this is our first one online. So cool to do that and to open it up to hopefully some more people. And hopefully people keep joining as they come in. So yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for contacting us and putting your name forward to host us. This is such a awesome topic, which I'm very passionate about. And yeah, I have to dash, but I cannot wait to listen to the recording and to keep learning about our menstrual cycle and how it impacts on us and how to use it as a tool for improving our performance in our training. So I will pass on to you now, and I can't wait to listen back and hear all the questions and the discussion that's gone on. So thank you again.
Wonderful. No, thank you. So, yeah, it's something that has been on my do list to do more of these sort of presentations. So, thank you for indulging me. So, welcome everyone. First of all, there is going to be a recording of this. So, if you have to dash out or can't watch the whole thing or are joining partway through, we are recording, and then Jean will send it around later on. And for those who have registered and are joining in, I have your email addresses, so I can also send it to you directly so you can refresh or go over anything that we are talking about today. So let's crack into it. So no mai, haere mai, welcome, and I appreciate you all joining in live, taking some time out of your evening to come and listen to me about this topic. I think you'll find it all worthwhile, even if you know a little bit about it. We'll hopefully go a bit further in depth, and you can put a little bit more into your training, or even talk to your coach about it if you have a coach. I welcome you to ask any questions. We have two ways of doing that. You can either unmute and ask if you're comfortable doing so, or there is a chat box option. So for those of you who are familiar with Zoom, you'll know where that is. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you'll just have to sort of go into your screen, and there will either be a drop-down menu, or if you're on your mobile, I think there's some little dots that you can press to find the chat. So feel free to pop anything in there as you think of it, and I'll either answer it then and there, or if it's in a slide later on, I'll let you know, and there'll also be question time at the end. So the reason why I wanted to do this particular topic is I think we can all agree that over the last few years, we've definitely been hearing more about training with your cycle, but I still find it difficult to come across coaches and women who are actually willing to put it into practice, and whether that's because of embarrassment or just not feeling like they know enough to even approach the subject. So hopefully by the end of this masterclass, you'll have a little bit more understanding of how your cycle works, what happens during the cycle phases, and how you can implement this into your running training. But remember, everyone is different, and this information is a guide only. And obviously, if you need more specific details, then we can go into that offline and have a bit more of an in-depth discussion as to how it relates to you more specifically. So let's get started, and here is what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about me for those who don't know me. We are then going to go on and talk about the cycle and phases, so a little bit of a biology or sex education lesson. And then we will talk about the training adaptations that you can make to tailor your training more towards your cycle. But we're not going to forget about menopause either. Pop in the chat if you're comfortable doing so, if you have gone through menopause, because it'll be interesting to know whether we're dealing with people who are still on that more monthly cycle, or whether you're in menopause, because there are differences that we are going to talk about. And then finally, we are going to talk about the difference between training and performance, because often we are concerned about, what happens if we get period on race day. Oh yes, and Petra, yeah, perimenopause, that's a can be quite a drawn out thing. So we are going to if you don't know the definition of menopause, for other people out there as well, we'll give that to you when we get to it. So yeah, quite an important transition. And then finally, we'll talk about my coaching and contact details if anyone has any further questions or wants to talk a little bit more in depth about it. So I'm Sierra Ryland. My maiden name is Sparksman, hence the name Sparkle Fitness. So I'm actually a member of Scottish and have run with them for many, many years now since I came to Wellington. So some of you might know me through there and through the interclub races and other events around Wellington. I also used to be a lawyer, but over the pandemic, I sort of didn't enjoy my legal career as much, and especially not while or after I had my daughter. So that picture there, she's about 1.5. She's now going to be going to school next year. So things are a lot different. Time does fly after the first year, of course. But what I wanted to do was devote a little bit more time to me and what I enjoyed, a work-life balance and family time. So a couple of years ago, I retrained as a personal trainer, quit my job and started Sparkle Fitness as my full-time money-earning job. So I do personal training and running and triathlon coaching, and my goal is to provide safe and effective training for women and mums. And I feel that this is really important because through my journey, I learned that you can't just necessarily go back to training the same way that you did before you had kids. Things have changed, and also just the demands on your time and energy are much different. So it wasn't quite as simple as just lacing up the shoes and heading back out the door and trying to do my pre-baby times and pre-baby training. It just didn't work anymore. And once I realized that and started focusing on strength training, fixing some of the pelvic floor issues that I had, even with a cesarean, and training a little bit more with that in mind, then I started to get back some of that fitness and that consistency. So obviously it's a journey and we make mistakes along the way, but I'm trying to learn from them and then pass on that knowledge as well. And then as you can see down the bottom, I'm a mum safe trainer, which means I've done safe return to exercise courses to help women return to exercise safely, taking into account the postpartum nature. I'm an Evolution affiliated trainer, which is a online education course for women to teach you about the different phases of your life, from periods, pregnancy, postpartum and menopause. So similar to what we're doing today, but today is more training focused, whereas that one is more general education focused. I'm a TriNZ accredited coach and also registered with reps. So your cycle. We are not linear. We are cyclical beings, but sometimes we are tried to fit in a linear world, and often the training plans that are set or that we can find online are based on 4 weeks, often 3 weeks on, 1 week recovery or easing back. And most of us do not have a period that is or a menstrual cycle that is exactly 4 weeks long. What we do have are 2 phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And then within that phase, we have the menstruation. Day 1 of your period is day 1 of your cycle. So then we move into pre-ovulation, ovulation, and then pre-menstruation. So the right side of your screen, the follicular phase, is the low hormone phase. And the left side, the luteal phase, is your high hormone phase. And even if that's all you take away from it, you split it in half and you've got low and high hormone phase, that's fine. That's a good takeaway. So When you are in your low hormone phase and starting of your period, you are moving into that estrogen dominant phase. Your estrogen, though, will start out low and it's going to build up over that phase as your follicles mature to produce the eggs that will be or maybe fertilized later. So this is where you can have the most variation in your cycle from woman to woman. So as I said, most women's cycles are not 28 days long. That's more the average. And if yours is longer, it's usually because this follicular phase is longer because it takes longer for those follicles to mature and produce their egg. The other important thing about this phase here is that, as I said, it's the low hormone phase. So all hormones are low. Your estrogen, your progesterone, your cortisol is lower. And this is why you may have heard people say this is when you're most like a man. And the good thing about this is that you can hit those training intensities harder. So when we talk about training adaptations later on, we're going to talk about what type of training is going to best suit this phase. However, of course, it isn't always as simple as that, and you may have if you have bad cramping or bad periods, heavy periods, you may not quite feel so fantastic during the start of this phase, maybe even fatigued, maybe a little emotional or anxious, but this is actually due to the low hormones. So it's not because you're hormonal and have hormones running all over the place, it's actually because of those low hormone phases. You're going to move into pre-ovulation, so estrogen's built up. And you may notice that you actually are now starting to feel really great, and there's an increase in your energy levels and your sexual interest, of course, because your body is telling you that you're ready to ovulate. And then you will keep moving through that phase into the early luteal phase. So just after ovulation. So again, you'll still be feeling really good. The body still thinks that there's a chance that you might get pregnant. And so it's building a uterine lining for any possible fertilized egg. And so a lot of energy is going to start going into that. So you may notice a few changes in your energy levels around there and your demands for energy around there. You'll also potentially still feel quite good, superwoman, and you might start getting that boost of testosterone, which are going to help to push those workouts a little bit harder as well. However, some women can feel a little bit flat around ovulation. So again, you do still need to be guided by how you feel and how your body feels, because not everyone reacts in exactly the same way to those changes in hormones and the hormonal levels. But what is going to start happening is once your body realizes that there is no fertilized egg, progesterone is going to start increasing, and you're going to start moving into that high hormonal phase as the body prepares to shed that uterine lining, get rid of everything, and going into that bleed. So this is when you're going to start to notice those PMS symptoms may begin. And again, everyone's going to be slightly different with their PMS. But one thing that is fairly similar across all women is this phase is relatively consistent in its days. So I've got the follicular phase, about 1 to 14-ish days, give or take, and then the remaining 14 days or so in this high hormonal phase. So one thing that I recently started to associate with my cycles, and this came from doing a little bit of tracking, is that when I start to move through this high hormone phase, I start to get a little bit hungry, and my cravings for especially things like chocolate and carby foods starts to increase. And what I've learned is that's a sign that my period's probably going to be starting in the next week. So does anyone else have that same sort of thing. You can pop it in the comments if you notice like the hunger levels start to increase and the cravings start to increase around that time. So again, that's perfectly normal. And I think fighting those cravings is sometimes worse. It's not like you have to give in and binge eat everything, but what we'll talk about later on is that's why it's important to have good protein and increase your protein intake around this time, because it is normal to feel hungrier, and it's not a bad thing and it's not a guilt thing. It is just what is happening as part of your cycle and part of that breakdown and reset. So now that hopefully we've all ticked that box into here is our cycle, here is how we move through those phases, let's see a little bit more about the effect that this can have on your body in terms of energy demand. So regardless of whether you're thinking about having kids, you've already had kids and you don't want any more, I'm sorry, but reproduction is going to take priority. Unfortunately, that is just the way women are wired, whether you want it or not, whether you like it or not. But what I want to also get across is that this doesn't mean that your training goals can't take priority as well. But what we want to do is have a nice little mesh together of your training goals with your cycle, so that you then can get the most out of your training and not feel like you're constantly fighting fatigue and fighting low energy and pushing. No matter how hard you work, you just feel like you're not getting anywhere. So that's really why I'm talking about this training. We don't want to compete with our cycles, we want to work with it. So when you are in that menstrual phase, your period, all hormones are at their lowest. But as I said, you may have period-related symptoms. So of course, be guided by your own symptoms, and particularly also endometriosis is an entirely separate and different thing, and people can feel quite awful around that time. But the positives are that because you're in a low hormone state, your cortisol, your stress hormone, is also low. So this is why it's really great to hit those high intensities in this menstrual phase and the pre-ovulation phase. You have an increase in your pain tolerance, believe it or not. I don't know how they test that. And so it's a good opportunity to push harder to improve your muscle strength and your fitness gains. And also your recovery is faster because of the hormones being lower, and your inflammation levels are usually lower because of it. So hence, that's why it's a good time to hit those high intensity sessions, interval training, all that sort of thing, lifting heavy weights, all that thing that's really starts to do, some max effort on your part. But what we also have when we come into the ovulation phase is there is a release of relaxin. Now, I didn't know this. I thought that was just something that was pregnancy related. So those of us who have had kids will know that relaxin makes our joints and ligaments all loose in preparation for birth. But even when we ovulate, we get a little bit of a dose of it. So what this means is that we can be more susceptible to injury around ovulation time. So particularly if you are hypermobile, or perhaps you do have a tendency to roll your ankles, it may not be a good idea to go on trails around that time. And so focusing on form and technique is really important. And there is research out there, I think mainly around like your AFL and rugby type players, where women tend to get ACL injuries, and it's usually around this time, those knee injuries. So really good to be aware of that, particularly if you do have a lot of movement in your knees, say, for running. When we start then to go into that low luteal phase, as I said, the focus is on building the uterine lining. You have an increased energy demand, and so you may feel a little bit hungry then even, and then the progesterone is going to start to increase. In this high hormone phase, what is particularly hard to do is to make muscle and maintain it, and this is due to estrogen. So it affects muscle and cell turnover and protein synthesis. And then what happens when the progesterone hormone increases, it turns up the catabolism of muscle tissue. So the muscles, our body eats itself. And that is because once it realizes it's not pregnant, it wants to eat away at the uterine lining to get rid of it and reset and build a new one in the next phase. So we have a lot of demands here on our body, which is why you may start to feel a little bit sluggish, a little bit tired. We have highest cortisol, higher stress levels. Our body is eating itself essentially, and our body is finding it harder to produce and maintain muscle because it is trying to break it down. And when we exercise, what is happening essentially is we are slowly breaking down our muscle so that it can rebuild bigger and stronger. So we do, when we are training, want that muscle breakdown, but not so much that it causes injury. So when we're in this state, this is why it is generally recommended to do more endurance and sub-threshold based workouts because of the demands on your body at this time. So I hope that all makes sense. If anyone is thinking of any questions, please put them in the chat as we go along, or feel free to unmute and ask away. But we'll go on now to the next slide. So as I mentioned, in the high hormone phase, cortisol is at its highest and the body is focused on shedding that lining. So in the low hormone phase, we have less inflammation, so that's what makes our recovery a lot faster. Here, because of estrogen and ovulation, we have a little bit more inflammation. So it's going to make that recovery a little bit longer and a little bit harder. So we really need to focus on good recovery techniques and practices in this stage. And this is so, one, we don't get injured, but also two, because we can be a little bit more susceptible to illnesses around this time because the energy demands are focusing on reproduction, which is going to take away from other systems like immunity. So if you ever notice that you might have a little cold, a little sniffle, maybe a little sore throat in the weeks leading up to your period, this might be why, just because that body is under more stress and using energy for other things. So the best way to see your trends is through tracking your cycle. And this is something that I've only just recently started doing myself. Does anyone else here track your cycle? It would be really, it's really a good idea in terms of giving yourself that information. So if you track what you eat, I think it's probably way more important to track your cycle. And there are some good apps for doing this. Oh, great, Natasha. Do you use either Wild AI or Fitter Woman? Those are the two that I use that I find are really good, and for different reasons. Yeah, tracking what you eat. Yeah. So and I think then if you track what you eat and you track your cycle, and then you notice that you start having like cravings at certain times of your cycle and you can start to match it up, it really gives a few aha moments. Fitter Woman is one I use because I like the oh yeah, Garmin, I forgot about that one. Yeah, my watch does that as well with the app. I'll tell you what I like about Fitter Woman is the calendar predicts really well where my next period is, and then I can just go into the calendar and just have a look and a little bit of an overview. So then that makes it really, I find it quite accurate for predicting when my next cycle is going to be, so giving me a bit of a heads up. And obviously you can put in your symptoms and any sort of like bloating, cravings, illness and that sort of thing to match up. It does have workout recommendations and things depending on where you are in your cycle, but the app that I find that is better for that side of things is Wild AI, and you can use that every day, and then every morning you can wake up, you can put in how much you slept, how stressed you're feeling, any acne, bloating, all of those sorts of things. And then it will give you a readiness score for how ready you are to train that day. And then you can make any changes based on that readiness score, and it will also give you suggestions for how you should train that day, like easy rides, easy runs, depending on what you do, weights, that sort of thing. And it will even give little mini programs in there. And the other good thing that I found about it is that it gives me a little reminder after the training to eat so much protein, have some carbohydrates, massage and foam roll, so you can tick those things off if you're one of those people who like the checklists and like ticking things off, and they serve as good reminders there. So those are the two that I use and that I think are quite good. I'm sure there are some others out there. I'll just give you a little tidbit that I found from a study, because talking about recovery and immunity and how your immune system is sort of competing for energy around this time. One study that I found, it's called the menstrual cycle and its effect on the immune status of female endurance runners. They concluded that in ovulatory female endurance runners whose physical and emotional stress is stable, they didn't notice any significant fluctuations in their immunity levels due to the increase in progesterone during the menstrual cycle. But I think there the key is obviously that they have physical and emotional stress is stable. When those things start to go out, then that can obviously have an impact on other things, especially when you are in a high hormone phase and a phase where you're more prone to inflammatory reactions, and as I said, the higher stress hormone anyway. But so it's not to say that you necessarily will get sick, but it's just, it might be a little bit easier given what is happening in your cycle. Let's move on to some training adaptations now. So, has everyone heard of the term periodization in terms of exercise rather than periodization as periods? So it's a definition that is often used maybe more in the gym than with running, but we do exactly the same thing with our running training. So the goal of periodization is to maximize your gains while also reducing your risk of injury and the staleness of the protocol over the long term. So what I mentioned before about the 3 weeks on, 1 week off, that's periodization, and you have that monthly and yearly as well. So often we might be training for some key events over the course of a year, and then we'll have our like off season, on season, etc. So that is periodization. But of course, with our periods, we also, as we have found out, have some form of periodization every month or so in terms of those phases. So if we're thinking in terms of those 4 phases that we're going to cycle through on the period, we then also want to have them have our training match them and cycle through them, as we touched upon in those previous slides. So coming back to the low hormone phase, remember days 1 to 14-ish, as I mentioned, this is a great time to hit those higher intensities and those harder workouts. So your intervals, your maximum efforts, heavy resistance training, your body is primed to do this and is going to respond really well to it theoretically. However, we still want to follow a good training guideline. So just because we're in a low hormone phase doesn't mean that we can suddenly go out and run 6 or 7 days a week if we are not used to that. We still want to follow things like the 10% rule and follow good recovery practices. So even though we do recover quicker, it doesn't mean we don't need rest days or massaging and stretching and all of those sorts of things. Also, hopefully most of you would never run 2 hard days back to back anyway. That's another general rule that runners follow. So even though you can do more higher intensity sessions, be it the gym or the running here, we'll say harder, not necessarily more frequent, You still don't want to back up too many days up. So if you're going to be hitting the gym a lot during 1 week, you want to still cycle through easy and hard, and not just try and go hard out every time. Because the whole point of doing something at that max intensity is that you then have recovery periods. So we want to have our hard runs feel hard and our easy runs feel really easy. So that's another general rule that you've probably heard thrown about before, but that is why, because we sometimes want these runs to be painfully easy, so that we don't fall into the trap of running everything at that sort of kind of comfortably hard. It's not easy, but it's not hard. And then when you try and do a hard session, you just feel a little bit flat. And then when you do an easy session, you think you need to run it a little bit harder because you didn't run hard enough the other day. So if you can get into the habit of running those easy runs so they feel really easy, you can spout full sentences without getting puffed, and then you can hit those hard runs really hard and have those big changes in pace and differences in effort, then you're going to really be able to start to notice big improvements in your training if you're not already doing that. So as I said, don't mistake this for me saying you don't need rest days. You absolutely still do need rest days, but now is just a good time to structure in those intense, high intensity interval sessions here where you're trying to really boost your fitness. In terms of fueling, your body is primed to access, 10% rule, sorry, I'll go back and answer that. Increase your mileage or your intensity by 10%, no more than 10% a week. So if you, and it's not necessarily the same thing as, like, if you're only doing 2 runs a week, adding in a third one's probably going to be more than 10%. So there are always exceptions to the rule. But so for example, say your long run is, what's an easy figure, 60 minutes, then the next week you might do 66 minutes and just add on 10% each time. And the same would go for the intensity. You would increase the intensity or the amount of intensity by roughly 10%. And because otherwise, if you did too much, it might just lead to injury. So usually if you're doing no speed work, you might just chuck in 1 speed work session and that follow that sort of thing, slowly adding more in. And it's not just the effort that necessarily makes something, it's not necessarily, yes, the effort that makes something intense or hard. So for example, a long run is generally done at quite an easy pace, but the longer you are out there, the more that's going to go into a harder, higher intensity type of session, because it's starting to tax your body more and more by being out there for longer. So just because it's easy or feels easy at an easy pace doesn't mean it's not a higher intensity session by the end of it. So that's why you just don't go out and just run for hours and hours and hours at an easy pace and think that was easy, I can still do intervals the following day, etc. So I hope that made sense. Fueling. Carbohydrates, they are your friend. You want to use them here, and you want to make sure that you have carbohydrate available for these sessions, because we're going to be doing higher intensity sessions during this time. They are going to need fuel, and carbohydrate is broken down by the body quicker than fat and protein, so then is available as glucose and glycogen to be used for energy when you are running and trying to hit those high intensity sessions. So for example, if you're out in a long run, you want to be fueling during that long run and having some of those carbohydrates to keep you topped up while you're running. If you've got maybe a shorter but more intense session to do, then you're going to want to make sure you have something to eat within that sort of 2 hours. You generally don't want to go into training sessions without having something to eat within 2 hours. Obviously, your stomach is going to dictate how much you can eat, So if you haven't had a main meal, or you have had a main meal, sorry, you might just need a little bit of a top up, like a banana or something really easily digestible before you go out. Okay, then the high hormone phase, that luteal phase, days 14 to 28. So all the hormones are starting to get higher across this phase, including cortisol. So the body is under more stress, as we've discussed, and you may be more affected by other stresses in your life. So in the early luteal phase, so I think day 14, what's going to happen is progesterone is going to start to increase, and its main job is to shuttle glucose and amino acids away from the liver and the skeletal tissue to build that uterine lining. Again, this is when it thinks you still might have a chance of being pregnant, because we've just had ovulation. So that increases your energy needs slightly, and we've talked about how you may feel like you need to eat a little more then. What is also going to happen as progesterone starts to increase, it's going to elevate your core temperature. So your body's going to feel hotter, but it also makes it harder for your body to cool itself down into sweat. So as a result, you may notice that your sweat seems more salty, like if you're brushing the sweat off and it feels like a little bit gritty. So to compensate for this, you're going to need to drink more water before your workout. So you may notice either that you're really thirsty after your workout, so you might need to preempt that by drinking a little bit more before your workout, so that it's easier for your body to cool itself off. So because of things like this, the higher core temperature, harder to sweat and cool yourself down, the extra stress that your body is under, good time for endurance and those sub-threshold sessions. So just paring it back a little bit. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to ease off your training or you don't train. It's just the type of training will move more to the endurance side of things. Okay. Now, one of the other things that is going to happen that we talked about is that muscle breakdown, and it being harder for your body to rebuild the muscle. So what we want to do then is up our protein intake around this time. And one of the ways to do that is by eating things like whey protein. And one of the things it contains is leucine and an amino acid, and that's the amino acid that is one of the ones that is responsible for muscle building. So generally good to have it anyway. And this is where you want to start to include this sort of stuff in your recovery strategy and prioritize that recovery. So one of the things in the past that we've seen is chocolate milk, which is a great sort of way to recover in terms of it's got carbs, it's got a bit of protein, it's got a bit of sugar, all of that sort of thing. But in order to really sort of bump up the protein hit a bit more, you can have it with something like a handful of almonds, and then you can have a more complete recovery snack and something that's going to keep that emphasis on trying to maintain and build as much protein as you can. So one of the other things to do is to make sure that you do eat that protein within 30 to 45 minutes of exercise, so that your body can then use it to recover, rather than, as we're talking about, that catabolic state, rather than encouraging it to continue to break down muscle to recover from the workout. So also the higher estrogen that you'll have in your body as well. This doesn't use as much carbohydrate. The body doesn't use as much carbohydrate in this stage, so it turns more to fat for its fueling. But one of the issues with this, as I alluded to before, is that fat takes longer to break down to become into a source that can be used for energy to fuel the workouts. So you're still going to need to have a carbohydrate intake for your workouts that are going to require it. So those more endurance, longer sessions, or any sort of intensity that you are going to do, you will still need to make sure that you have carbohydrate available for it, because your body won't be making it as readily available as it might otherwise do. So do make sure you fuel well in your training and around your training. because we don't want to go into that low energy state, because that's all that's going to do is signal muscle breakdown, and we want to encourage muscle building and repair. So one of the things that I'll just note, protein recommendations, because it is different. Like if you look at the Ministry of Health, the protein intakes and recommendations there are a bit on the lower side, and they don't break it down into men and women. But for athletic women or women who train deliberately, and this doesn't mean that you have to be great or elite or a pro, anything like that, but if you're training deliberately, then the recommendation that I've got from Dr. Stacey Sims and her research is 2 to 2.3 grams per kilo of body weight. So if you're 65 kilos, then that's 130 grams a day, which can seem like quite a lot. And if you track it, you might find that it's quite hard initially to hit that protein intake, because essentially you have to be having protein with every meal and a decent amount of protein with every meal. When you are in this high hormone stage, you want to be closer to that 2.3 gram. And then when you're in the lower hormone phase, you can be closer to that 2 gram end. So let's move on to talk about menopause. And I think someone at the start mentioned about being in perimenopause, which, you know, can seem like it takes forever, because menopause is a distinct moment in time. So it is when you have not had a period for 12 months. That is then, by definition, when you are in menopause. So up until then, you're in perimenopause, and that can be, you know, start like 10 years out or anything like that, where you might find that your cycles sort of fluctuate and become a little bit unpredictable, and you start having those signs of menopause, like hot flushes, brain fog. There's actually something like 32 symptoms, but hot flush is like the main one that people sort of talk about. So in the training adaptations, we are going to need to do things differently. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have some sort of cyclical training, but even though once you're in menopause, you don't necessarily have the same hormone fluctuations anymore, but there are still things that menopausal women will need to do a bit differently from others. Because when you are in that peri and post-menopause years, your estrogen levels are actually just decreasing as a whole, and there can be a sudden drop-off through menopause, which means that your muscle mass is going to decrease more rapidly as well, and it's going to be harder to maintain it. So what this means is that strength training becomes even more important to maintain your muscle mass and your bone density. And then it's going to be about the quality over quantity and having purpose over junk miles. But slow and steady runs may not necessarily produce the same results for you. Have you ever done it, or you might know or have seen women who are just constantly running all the time, usually in an effort to lose weight, and it's not really working, because women who are in menopause, they don't really see the same benefits anymore from traditional cardio exercises, especially just steady state cardio exercises. So they need very strong stresses on the body, like high intensity activity, to actually improve their cardio and get better fitness responses to the demands that they're putting on their body. So this is where I've got, you still need stress stimulus and high intensity activity when you are in menopause. It is not that you just ease back and slow and steady wins the race. Of course, any movement is good movement, but if you're still interested in getting fitter and stronger, then you need high intensity training in there. So one of the best types is the HIIT training. If you've heard of that, it's high intensity interval training, and it's high intensity for you, not it's usually a percentage of your heart rate. And there's been a few studies done that show that menopausal women respond very well to this, and usually the best duration is a very short one, like 30-second max, all out efforts with short recoveries in between. So if you've heard of Tabatas, these are another form of high intensity interval training. They're usually 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. So 20 seconds something very hard, 10 seconds active recovery. So in terms of running, how you would do it is you could do like a 20 to 30 second all out run, and then a 10-second jogging or walking recovery. And you would repeat that 6 to 8 times. Then you'd have a 5-minute rest. And again, that rest might be a jogging or walking recovery. And then you repeat that for 2 or 3 more rounds. So what you're actually doing is still an interval type session, but the intervals are just much shorter. Obviously, if you're training for events, you're probably going to gear your training a little bit more towards like whether it's a marathon, half marathon, etc. But in terms of just general performance advice for menopausal women, they respond really well to those short, high intensity interval sessions. And the other good thing about running and bone density, because we often hear a lot of things like running is bad for your knees and it's bad for your joints, but putting that high impact onto your joints is going to help with bone density. And of course, it's always a matter of your limitations. You don't overdo it, but again, it is a good stress for the bones and the muscle mass as long as you don't overdo it, and can in some cases help prevent things like osteoporosis as we age by keeping that impact in our joints. So what about fueling when you're in menopause? So again, protein, very important. You may think that you don't need to, say, eat as much, or you might not need to eat as much protein if your muscle mass is decreasing, but actually we want to keep the muscle mass, so we need to encourage it as much as we can. So we still want to eat lots of protein. And for menopausal women, it's still up around menopausal active women who train, I'll say, still up around that 2 grams per kilo of body weight range anyway. But unfortunately, fructose is not your friend when you're in this stage. Now, fructose is a fruit sugar, so it's not saying fruit are not your friend, because when you eat fruit, it's not quite the same as when you eat a gel that's just concentrated fructose. So you may find that you get upset stomachs on things like gels or sports bars or energy drinks that are really high in that type of sugar. And that's just usually because of the reaction to the gut to that sudden overload. So apparently, yeah, fructose not good. So finding some way of fueling that involves other forms of sugars will be better for you. And the reason why this can become quite important is because it's a fruit sugar. It's a natural sugar, so you will find it in a lot of natural products or organic products. But it may not actually sit that well if your gut. So if you're menopausal and you're finding that your, usual energy bars or gels aren't sitting right anymore, that could be why. So have a look at the ingredients and see if it's got fructose in it, and maybe try something without it. So avoid fructose, up your protein, think about low GI carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables, just for your general health and your general dietary intake anyway. But if you do that, that will still encourage that muscle growth. So finally, let's talk about training and performance. So you can perform at every stage of your cycle. It's not the end of the world if you have your period on race day, or even if you're in that high hormone state and you just feel sluggish and you can't hit the high intensities, because performance is just one point in time where you lay it all on your line. Performance has such a big mental component, which is why I think when we've been conditioned to think that periods are bad and that we can't perform well when we have it, sometimes it's more of just an inconvenience, as in there's no proper toilets, there's nowhere to dispose of sanitary products. And maybe if it's like water related and you don't use tampons, then it just becomes all a bit too hard. But the research suggests that there's actually no reason why you can't perform. And as we've talked about, you're in that low hormone state, so it's a perfect time to perform. But you may just need to tweak your hydration and your fueling depending on what stage of the cycle that you're in. And of course, depending on what stage that you're in, the efforts might feel harder or easier, right? But what the studies have shown is that even though you've got all these physiological changes in different phases of your cycle, there's been no real link to any significant changes in actual performance. So it's all just mental, right? Like a positive mindset is going to do so much more for you. Of course, if, as I mentioned at the start, if you have period-related symptoms, endometriosis, those sort of things, that's going to be a different story. So you're always going to be guided by how you feel. But I just want to reassure everyone that if you have your period, it's not the end of the world, because obviously we cannot necessarily dictate when events are going to be. Of course, we can choose whether to enter them or not, but unfortunately, once the date is set, the date is set. The other good thing about being in your low hormone phase is that the energy that is used for those high hormone phase systems are now at your disposal. So again, you might feel that you have more energy, so it is a great time to do a race. Okay. As I said, yeah, qualify this by always listening to your body though, and any individual symptoms that you have. So feel free, if you've got any questions from what I've been talking about, either you can unmute and ask them or pop them in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on that while I wrap up, because we are coming up to the hour. Here are some contact details for me. So I'm on Instagram and Facebook, so feel free to follow me, because I do give a lot of tips that are running and triathlon related for coaching and training as well. And I also have a offer here where I mentioned at the start, if you want to talk about this more in more depth and in more detail, please do reach out. You can, no obligation, 30-minute call, and we can have a bit more of a chat. And I'll pop that link in there if you want to go in and book a time, and we can just have a chat about this and a little bit further. If you want any more coaching advice and that sort of thing, I can give you some options there. Oh, thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Teresa. I've also will just share this last slide with you. If you're interested in any of the references that I've talked about, there are some links here. Evolution, as I mentioned, the course, the book Raw from Dr. Stacey Sims. If you don't have it, I highly recommend it. I've got one of the first copies, but she's even now got full books on menopause and all that sort of thing, along with the articles and some of the studies that I've cited. Do I have something like this talk available for coaches? The short answer to that is essentially a yes, and I would probably do something very similar to this one, because often what I find the issue is, as I said at the start, is that people don't really talk about it. So a lot of the thing is the coach and the athlete being able to have that conversation to then go, okay, well, how long is your cycle? So you're going to need to track it, and being open with the tracking, being open with the symptoms, and sharing that information with your coach, so then they can actually program in your training cycle to match your menstrual cycle, and then being able to adapt it if, for instance, some months your cycle is shorter, some months your cycle is longer. Because particularly if, I'll say one thing, if you're on contraceptive, then this stuff doesn't really apply because you're always in a high hormone state. So if you're not on like a pill contraceptive that affects your hormones, then you may find there's a slight variation month to month, or some people may be very regular. But it is about having that conversation, getting a track in place so that you can then start to go, okay, we're going to hit higher intensities at this time, then we're going to hit more endurance, and we're going to then pay a little bit more attention to things like, do you get lower back pain at certain times of your cycle, maybe around ovulation due to the release of relaxin, or maybe in the high hormone state because everything's just a little bit stressed and a little bit tense. So yes, I'm very happy to put together something that can speak a little bit more to coaches. Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Vicky. Oh yeah, male coaches. Yeah. Yeah. Although I do find that even female coaches, it's, the same can be true for them as well. But yes, male coaches, I have a male coach. He doesn't ever ask me about my cycle, and I really want him to, but then some of that's on me to tell him that I need to do it. So yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for watching, everyone. As I say, feel free to reach out if you have any more questions, or book in a time slot to talk about some of this stuff in more detail. And yeah, this hopefully won't be the only presentation that I'll do, because I can talk a lot more about things like fueling and nutrition, and go into some of these details maybe a little bit more in depth. So I hope I'll be back and we can do some more woman related or woman specific topics as well. But have a good evening, everyone. And awesome picture. Yes. If anyone does have any topics, feel free to send them to me as well, anything you want to know more of. But thank you, everyone. And as I said, I'll send out the recording so you can have this as a reference and have those slides as a reference as well. Enjoy, ka kite, and happy running.